I'm going to start actually by asking John Lynn from Pfizer to really give us the view on how big pharma, if you like, how processes can be accelerated, how research and development can be accelerated and be made more efficient.
Thank you, Vivek, for the opportunity. I had the pleasure of participating in drug research and development in both a small biotech company and also in a big company. About 9 years ago, I was in a small biotech company in San Francisco called Rinat Neuroscience, and the company was acquired by Pfizer in that year. And so I've seen different type of environments where drug research can be conducted. And I would say that it is indeed very different. In a small company, we tend to take more risks, move project faster into the clinic, maybe with slightly less data. But in a big company, things get a little bit slower, and we want to have more confidence in our data package before we move on to the clinical development. So there are different ways of doing things. However, I also remember about 9 or 10 years ago, there was a lot of talk about declining pharma R&D productivity, declining number of drug approval. But just in the past few years, we see a sea change in drug R&D productivity. A huge number of new compounds and with a very significant clinical impact have been approved. Just around 2010, Pfizer also embarked on a kind of an internal improvement in R&D productivity. We turned it kind of the R&D turnaround process. And just in the past 4 years, we have seen 4 new cancer drugs approved. And the most recent example is our ER-positive breast cancer drug, palbociclib, which was approved with a very small study with a very promising doubling of progression-free survival in breast cancer patients. That resulted in a breakthrough designation and FDA approval within a span of less than 2 years. So we're very happy that things have been improving in a big company that are trying to emulate the way that small companies have been producing R&D results. So I think certainly big companies and small companies can learn from each other and collaborate as well.
So you mentioned there the FDA breakthrough program. So Martha, can I ask you about how FDA is responding to this need to accelerate the entry of products into the market?
So in our office, we're very fortunate to be able to take advantage of several expedited programs that we can use to work with sponsors and developers of cancer therapeutics to help hasten the delivery of effective and safe therapies to cancer patients who need them. And so I think breakthrough therapy designation is our newest expedited program, and that is a provision whereby if we see preliminary clinical data showing that an investigational therapy has the potential to provide a substantive improvement over existing therapies, and these are therapies that we generally consider have the potential to be transformative. If sponsors apply for breakthrough therapy designation, we will grant it. And what that allows is it really helps us enable a focusing of our resources, the clinical reviewers, statisticians, our CMC, our chemists, to work as a team to really be a proactive, collaborative partner with the sponsor to try to oversee clinical development in such a way that it can be conducted as efficiently as possible. And it kind of shifts us from a more reactive approach to a more proactive role in trying to identify potential problems that can occur and troubleshoot them early on rather than waiting until towards the end of the process. So it's really a privilege to be able to be part of that. And I know that palbociclib was one of the big successes of that. I think we've approved about 8 therapies that have been previously given breakthrough therapy designation, and it's still a relatively new program enacted under FDASIA in 2012. But at least some of our preliminary internal numbers show that it does hasten approval of therapies and cuts the development time. about 2 years, and that's really preliminary assessment at this point because we don't have a lot of experience, but I think it does show that when we're able to have a more all-hands-on-deck approach and have more opportunity for collaborative interactions with sponsors, that we are able to move things through more quickly. So it's something that's exciting to be part of that. We also have other expedited programs that we have a lot more experience with. One is priority review, which shortens our review time by about 4 months compared to traditional review times. So for therapies that we think, if approved, would provide a real improvement over existing therapy, we'll shorten our review timeline to about 8 months compared to the traditional 12 months for the newer therapies. And we also have accelerated approval, which allows us to approve therapies based upon a surrogate endpoint that's reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit. So not based upon overall survival, because we recognize that in some diseases it may take years and years to study and determine whether a therapy improves overall survival, but based upon a response rate that's durable in some subsets of populations or progression-free survival. And we also have fast track designation, which is also used as well quite frequently. So I think over 3/4 of the therapies that we ultimately approve, because cancer is a serious illness, do take advantage of at least one of those expedited programs.
So there's you mentioned 3 different pathways, is that right?
There's breakthrough therapy designation,
Yep.
Which allows for more intensive collaboration between FDA and sponsors who are developing cancer therapies or any therapy for any serious illness, but I'm speaking about cancer, so I'm focused on that. There's priority review, which shortens our review timeline by about 4 months from the time a new drug application or biologics application is submitted to when we ultimately make a decision on whether or not to approve the therapy. Then there is accelerated approval, which allows us to look at a risk-benefit based upon a surrogate endpoint as opposed to a hard endpoint like overall survival. And then there is fast-track designation, which allows us to review applications on a rolling basis rather than waiting for the entire application to be complete before we look at it.
Okay, thank you. And so, Mitch, now we've heard about what Big Pharma has been doing, and we'll probably go back to John to hear about his previous experience in biotech. But you come from venture-backed biotech community. So how is it different there? How do we accelerate drug development there?
Well, Vivek, first off, thanks very much for having me. But let's not forget that the title of today is about the war on cancer. And cancer is a very personal issue. How many of you in the room have either yourself or had a direct relative affected by cancer? I mean, look around the room. That's all of us. And so we're obviously here to talk about the business issues of that. My mom died from breast cancer when she was 26 years old. Her mom died in her late 30s from breast cancer. My sister got tested for the gene and was positive and had bilateral mastectomies and hysterectomy when she was 31 years old. So for me, at a young age, I wanted to cure cancer. And I had a lot of hope that we can cure cancer. And those hopes have kind of come and gone over the last several decades. But I'd emphasize to you now that there's never been a more prominent time than we're in right now that we really truly do have the opportunity to cure cancer. And that's going to be through innovation that occurs in academia. We heard that today from City of Hope, whether that's occurring in new startup companies that are funded or through collaborations from industry. And that in combination, now the IT, information technology, is starting to come into the fold, and genomics and big data. And so for the first time, I think I could look into the future and I can see if you're diagnosed with the BRCA gene, that you have the ability to delete that out and you're not going to have to deal with the consequences of having the BRCA mutation. And we're going to be able to do that for several of the genotypes that we know that are highly predictive of malignancy. We're starting to identify the CDH1 gene for gastric cancer that's highly prevalent and highly predictive of gastric cancer. So with that, now cancer is becoming the #1 killer globally. We're going to see an immense aging of the population. So as the golden era of science comes upon us, and we can, I believe, cure cancer. I can't give you the time frame for that, but you can kind of see it happening on the horizon. For the first time with immunotherapy, we're getting long-term durable cures. The next issue that we're going to have to face is an aging population. So as we start to deal with cancer, we're going to have the aging issues that we're going to have to deal with. And I don't mean aging like 80 or 90 years old. I mean aging like 150, 200 years old. And that may seem crazy to you to bring that up, but that's a real issue that we're going to have to deal with. And that's why I think what Krishna has done with Calico to really start to deal with the aging issues is one of the biggest problems that we could start to think about. And the issues with aging, and you know a lot more about that, are directly correlated with the issues we're dealing with in cancer. Okay, and so for me, I've never been more excited to be in this world. I really think that the collaboration between IT, venture, biotech, and industry is going to be what advances this. And frankly, the FDA has been very forward-thinking in how to bring these products into the market. So it's a great time to be fighting the war on cancer.
Okay. And how can you either give examples or can you conceive of how these things are brought together to accelerate, the research and development component in any particular example?
Oh, for sure. So even if you just look at immunotherapy alone, we still don't know who's going to be a responder to certain types of immunotherapy and who's not. And so we're grasping at straws, really trying to look at biomarkers for who's going to respond to PD-1 inhibitors, PD-L1. There's going to be a whole slew of other immunotherapies that come out. It's going to be big data and patients that help us solve that issue. And if we can predict, and the FDA loves this, and certainly the payers are going to love this, okay, if we can predict who's going to respond to a certain form of therapy with a high degree of certainty, that's what we need.
So coming to you then, Krishna, Google Ventures. So what inspired Google to get into this space, and then what's it doing in terms of accelerating this?
So to take a step back, because a lot of times in a healthcare audience, people are not sure what Google's doing here, and maybe a little context around that. I was a computer scientist before, which is kind of how I angled into Google, but I'm also a physician. I practice at Brigham and Women's Hospital as an internal medicine doctor there. And the opportunity that came together with Google Ventures started in 2008, 2009, kind of as the economy, was falling apart. And that's when Google, along with a handful of colleagues, started this entity called Google Ventures. And the concept back then is the same as it is now, which is an independent venture entity that can invest in any area, even if it's not connected at all to any of the core businesses of Google. So people often ask, can Google Ventures invest in areas that don't have any sort of computational or IT component? And absolutely, we can, we will continue to do that. And we got into healthcare largely because it's one of the biggest unsolved areas. It's an area where obviously there's a lot of room for efficiency gains and a lot of completely unsolved problems. And for me, I practice 2 days a week, and every day I'm seeing patients, as many folks in the audience are, who I really have no tools for. And when I think of where we can be most impactful as a venture industry, it's in areas where it's too risky or too uncomfortable, for existing large companies to get into. There's all sorts of places for those companies to innovate and get into. We wanted to be in places that might even be more risky than where Google might, find itself comfortable. And so we didn't have any quota, we didn't have any goal to do as much healthcare investing as we're doing. We just kept seeing great opportunities. And we now stand at just about, I think it's actually now just over a third of our fund over time has been invested in life sciences. That includes pure therapeutics, pure diagnostics, pure med tech. We're doing a lot in payer provider. And one of the things that I think is becoming really clear to us is all of the interesting areas in healthcare are increasingly going to be areas that blur the boundaries between the traditional verticals inside of healthcare. Cancer's the most interesting place for us right now because it's where all of those things start to touch each other. How you bring immunotherapy, how you bring sequencing, how you bring payment into the system here, how you bring IT, all of these things are relevant, and there's actual business models in cancer. I spend a lot of time in cancer because I think it's an area where we can see these models start to come together. And I believe that over time we'll see these same models expand into other areas of medicine as well. But right now we can actually see we have examples of several great businesses, many of whom are in the audience or up here that really are making an impact in and around cancer. So that's kind of how we got to this area. I think you'll only see us as a venture fund certainly do more. I think you see Google doing a lot of things in and around health, but certainly I can speak from the venture perspective that all the things that we've seen to date, the fact that this sort of event exists, the fact that there's still patients who are coming in that we really don't have cures for despite the advances we're making. There's still large unsolved arenas, I think these are all reasons that we'll continue to be working quite a bit in these areas and trying to stretch the boundaries of what's comfortable.
So, I mean, one of the facts and figures we've got actually in our programs is about the cost of development. It's $1.2 billion, according to the Economist, so it must be right. And to get a cancer drug onto the market. Now, can you picture and can you explain how it might be the case that we can really change that by an order of magnitude? And similarly, the timeline, which is 10 to 15 years, is quoted here. And how? And this is a question to any of you actually. How can that come together?
I'll take that first.
Yeah.
I don't know where you got that number, but that's the exact number that we spent to bring our first drug to market at Dendron, Provenge. We spent $1.2 billion. And it took us 13 years to bring the first autologous cellular immunotherapy to market. And at the end of the day, we brought in a whole new field of immunotherapy that now is one of the mainstays of how we treat cancer. Can you lower that cost? I think there's a potential to do that if you can identify patients early on through a process called trial enrichment. So if you think that you're going to have a higher response rate, you can put a lower number of patients in your trials, and you're still going to have a significant power associated with it. So in the cell therapy space, for example, with CAR T therapy, you're not seeing 500, 700 patient trials for CAR T products. You're seeing 40, 50 patient pivotal trials. And so the costs are going to go down dramatically. Well, the costs are going down, but now you have drugs that are actually curative. Right? You have patients that are, that are basically uncurable that are now cured. And so what I really get excited about, and there's a lot of discussion over the last couple of weeks in the life sciences industry around cost. And the real discussion should not be on cost, but it should be on value. In other words, if you're curing patients of a disease, then you have a drug that's highly efficacious and providing true value to society, and that should be paid for. But if we're, no offense, just inventing another purple pill, right? We have a number of drugs for gas. That's not that game-changing for society. But everyone that raised their room and said you had a relative with cancer, I guarantee you that you would be very interested in finding a cure for that disease. And so paying for innovation is an important part of our industry. And I think what we're going to see is probably, and frankly, once we got approved, we were one of the few drugs that after we got approved, we immediately went to a CMS panel for a national coverage decision, which rarely happens in oncology. So I think you're going to see a closer collaboration, hopefully, between the FDA and CMS, and those issues are going to be hammered out in advance so we can make sure that innovation is reimbursed.